also known as Black Wall Street, had a black bank, and it was one of the most prosperous black communities in America. It was unfortunately burned down by white supremacists. Later in time, there was this emergence of new black-owned banks that coincided with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. With that in mind, I want to give you 4 points before we begin this conversation to express the importance of Black banking history and its relevance to modern financial activism. The first one, historical response to discrimination. Black-owned banks emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century as a direct response to widespread discrimination in the mainstream banking industry. These institutions provided essential financial services to Black communities when they were systemically excluded elsewhere, laying the foundation for economic empowerment and self-determination. The second one, ongoing economic empowerment. Black-owned banks continue to play a crucial role in supporting Black communities by providing access to capital, loans, financial services tailored to their specific needs. They serve as vital economic engines, managing over $5 billion in assets and fostering wealth building opportunities in underserved areas. They've been a symbol of resistance and activism. The Bank Black movement, which gained significant movement following the incidents of police violence in 2016, demonstrated how Black banking has become a form of modern financial activism. This movement encouraged individuals and organizations to move their money to Black-owned institutions as a way to protest systemic inequalities and support community development. They were pushing on these different financial levers of power. And it's how I got my start. After being in this banking industry for like 20 years, about 10 years ago, I co-founded Bank Black USA to be able to create a centralized resource for people to learn more about these Black banks and where they were located in the country. And so the last one I'd share is corporate and community support. Recent years, we've seen a surge of support for Black-owned banks, with major corporations like Netflix, Square, PayPal pledging hundreds of millions in investment. This influx of capital, it looks like it's estimated to be over 150 million since 2020, has strengthened these institutions and increased their capacity to serve and empower Black communities. This community work is like what we do here at Hip Hop Caucus when it comes to the Bank Black and Green campaign. The purpose of the Bank Black and Green campaign is to be able to shift the flow of capital and transform the banking industry for good. We're mobilizing impact investors to pour money into Black-owned banks who pledge not to finance the fossil fuel industry or mass incarceration, and reinvest that capital into the public health and safety of their communities that they serve. And we've made a lot of progress that we'll talk about. And so with that, let's get into the panel discussion. And so what we want to start off, let's start with some historical foundation, right? So Shennette, your work focuses on recovering little-known stories about African-American women in finance. Can you share a particularly impactful story that illustrates their resilience and the innovation during the early 20th century? And how does it connect to pioneers like Magdalena Walker?
Yes, definitely. One very little known story is the story of African-American women during the Roaring 20s. So when we usually think of the 20s, we think of the Harlem Renaissance. But in addition to this, cultural, artistic flowering, there also was a flowering of, African-Americans with investment in real estate, in extra legal businesses like the Numbers, and it really just the, kind of capitalizing on the business of leisure and pleasure in Harlem. And so what most people don't know is two really important women, one whose name is Lulu Robinson Jones, and the other's her mother-in-law, actually, Charity Jones, who find themselves really at the helm of a finance company, and it's the St. Luke Finance Company. So these two women are part of the Harlem Independent Order of St. Luke, and the Independent Order of St. Luke is a mutual aid society that was started by a free Black woman during the time of slavery, during the 1850s, and she started that society, to be one that was, by women for women. And it was meant to, provide for, not just, women's, needs, but also to help them to build their wealth, to channel that wealth into the kinds of things that they felt were important, which was, supporting each other and supporting other networks of women, but also building schools, caring for the elderly, educating children. And so if we fast forward up into the 1920s, what we find is that, actually into the 19 teens, like 1915, 1916, the Harlem St. Luke's are really struggling. They're pretty much broke. But these women have a vision. And I like to imagine that, thinking about Lulu Robinson Jones, that she came from the South. I said kind of, with a dream and through her own sweat. And so she, looked around her and she saw the, conditions that other ambitious working women like her were facing. And so they decided that they wanted to kind of shift the St. Luke from a focus just on people's, providing for a funeral or death, but to really provide for the needs of living, breathing, working women. And so they didn't come to Harlem, as financiers or as bankers, but determined to improve their own lives and their communities. They took on that role. And so they created this St. Luke Finance Corporation and went about the business of investing in Harlem real estate. And they really combined, like I said, that business of leisure. So, they were able to get a loan from the St. Luke Bank, which was a bank that was founded, as you mentioned, in 1903 by Magdalena Walker. It was the first bank, not just led by a Black woman, but that was largely financed by Black women and led and run by Black women, but also focused on the needs of Black women. It really understood the critical role that Black women played in their families as breadwinners and in their communities as community builders. And so these women are able to get a loan from the bank, but, investing in Harlem real estate, takes a lot of money. And so they become really creative about, channeling and leveraging the resources of the Black community in Harlem. And in the span of less than 10 years, they are able to buy 3 pieces of Harlem real estate. And one of them, they actually spend the modern day equivalent of about over $1 million remodeling it into their headquarters. And they also lease out space to businesses. They operate a dining hall. They have an auditorium, meeting rooms, and it is in these spaces that not only are they providing, affordable rents, high quality housing for Black families and communities, but they're also becoming vital hubs, of the community. But again, which I think is what we'll probably talk about here later, is kind of, an unfortunate consequence of Black success is often, jealousy, attracting negative attention, from officials who, decide that they decide to launch an investigation into the St. Luke's, at the end of the 20s, close to the, to the stock market crash, and the judge just decides that they're insolvent, even though they are providing jobs for dozens of African Americans. They're providing affordable housing. They are meeting community needs by giving out food and just providing for the community. And so they are forced to sell and give up some of their property. And so that to me is just a really important kind of example, little known example of that Black ingenuity, that Black genius and ambition and enterprise, where Black people try to use finance to carve out opportunities, and and to think about all the things that they are able to accomplish, even against the kind of barriers that they face, but then also to be, constantly reminded of the ways in which, these wealth building efforts continue to be undermined by issues around racism and discrimination.
No, I appreciate that. Like, I love this. I love this. And so I got one more quick question for you. It's like, when it comes to the Freedmen's Savings Bank, it's often seen as a symbol of hope and like also a cautionary tale. Like, how do you see its legacy influencing the challenges and strategies of like minority-owned banks today?
And I'll make this quick so that I can definitely excited to hear from my fellow panelists. I will just say that, it is important that we not forget to acknowledge that, the incredible wealth that flowed through that bank in the 9 years of its existence, billions of dollars of Black wealth, largely Black wealth, kind of flowed through the bank. And its demise had absolutely nothing to do with Black people. It had to do with, the white trustees and investors seeing this pool of, Black wealth and Black capital and investing it in, highly risky ventures with no consideration or even, input from, those Black borrowers. And it crippled the bank and led to its failure. But I would say that really, to me, as a symbol of hope and as a cautionary tale, the Freedmen's Bank is, even though African Americans were really crushed, by the failure of the bank. I mean, people's whole life savings were, wiped out. And it's also important to note that many Black institutions, so Black churches, Black businesses, Black clubs and societies, early unions, working people associations, everything that they had, was pretty much wiped out. But in the midst of that, African Americans then redoubled their efforts, understanding that they had to control their own institutions. That was the real lesson. That was the lesson of the Freedmen's Bank. It was showing, that African Americans, are, have always been able to, build wealth and, control money. They know how to spend it. They know how to invest it. They know how to save it. But this just really helped to make clear that they needed to control their own institutions.
I appreciate that. And I want to bring Dr. Winford to the stage, right? So your book on John Hervey Wheeler explores the intersection of Black banks and civil rights. So how did Wheeler and other Black bankers use their economic influence to advance civil rights causes? And what parallels do you see to today's financial activism?
Yeah, so again, thank you, Stefan, and to the Hip Hop Caucus for giving me this invitation to be a part of this panel. And I can't echo enough some of the things that Shennette has already said, especially the last comment about Black people understanding that in their relationship to banking, what they wanted the next go around was Black control. And it's also important to note that African Americans also understood that the Freedmen's Bank and that kind of experiment was one strategy, right, for them to access their economic sort of emancipation, their economic freedom, even if, when we talk about sort of everything that sort of happened, that's why they kept going also, because they also understood to some degree it was one strategy. In terms of John Hervey Wheeler, just to give you some quick context, John Hervey Wheeler was president of a bank called the Mechanics Farmers Bank in Durham, North Carolina, one of the Black Wall Streets from about 1952 to 1978. And he was also a civil rights lawyer. And one of the reasons why he went to law school was he felt that there was this connection between his economic lens, his economic experience as a banker, and what he could potentially do as a lawyer, as a civil rights lawyer. Some of how we understand Black economic independence in this first part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century, is grounded in how we understand the ideas of Booker T. Washington and his approach to racial uplift, in many ways focusing in on Black self-determination, sort of internal self-help, racial uplift as a pathway to social, political, and economic equality. But when we get to the 1930s, 1940s, that kind of formula, it didn't sort of come to fruition. In other words, African Americans, even though they had demonstrated their economic wherewithal, their voting rights, right, other kinds of rights, were inaccessible for them. And so here comes someone like John Herbert Wheeler and others. I should note many of the Black beauty culturalists who come along during that particular period. Tiffany Gill writes about this. They were adamant that you couldn't have Black economic power without having citizenship rights simultaneously. And so you needed educational equality, housing access, freedom of movement, voting rights, so forth and so on. Then that would provide you with a basis for obtaining Black economic power. And ultimately, it wasn't just for African Americans. That would be the pathway to prosperity, particularly in the South, right? When we think of this, I write about this notion of New South prosperity. But for John Herbert Wheeler, it's important to know that even as a banker who is beholden to particular kinds of institutions, he always made the case that organized pressure. He was head of a civil rights organization in Durham, had significant voting power in Durham. He worked within the Democratic Party on a local, state, and national level, had presidential appointments in the Kennedy administration and Johnson administrations, was a member of the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunities, forerunner to some of what we have with the Office of Economic Opportunity. He also, so organized pressure, the legal route, right? He argued some of those school legalization cases in the 1940s and took on other kinds of school legalization cases because he felt that educational access and educational equality was extremely important to Black economic opportunities, right? Especially during the 1940s, during World War II. Most African Americans are not going to college, right? But they are going into the trades. And many of those schools, those are white schools, particularly in Durham where he was located, they provided training for white students to take on those industry jobs. And they didn't replicate that with African American students. And so that was a basis for these school equalization cases during the 1940s. So he used the legal route. He used the political route. And he also focused in on public policy, right? Public policy was also important in terms of generating the bringing together the sort of intellectual and academic ideas with a way to sort of think about the practicalities of how to solve particular issues. And so he was adamant about that. And I think that's one thing when we think about what's sort of something that might be kind of lacking in some ways, is that there was a kind of interconnectedness in how he understood his economic lens, his background as a lawyer, the importance of politics, and the importance of, working within all of those sort of strands to accomplish particular goals that were rooted and grounded in economic rights for African Americans. So I think that's something that, we can sort of kind of come back to, is thinking about the ways in which, right, there's still the NAACP there, right? People are very critical, but that is still there as an organization. And I think one of the things that we have to do, especially in this context, we have to re-engage with those organizations that have been tried and true, the National Urban League, other organizations. But I think sometimes we sort of forget, right, their grounding traditionally, historically, in solving some of the issues of the day.
I appreciate that. And I got a quick follow-up for you, right? The Greenwood District of Tulsa, like we know as Black Wall Street, is often cited as this pinnacle of Black economic success before its destruction. Could you quickly share what lessons can we take from its rise and fall when addressing wealth gaps and building economic power today?
Yeah. Well, I think part of, and one of the things that is interesting is in Greenwood, to my knowledge, there wasn't a Black-owned bank in Greenwood. The Black banks in Oklahoma were in Boley, Oklahoma, Muskogee. I hope I'm not messing up the name, Oklahoma. And so in some ways, how we understand the financial impact of Greenwood kind of forgets in many ways some of these other places, these all Black towns that also had emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century. But I think some of the lessons of Greenwood is one thing is important, is that Black economic success, Black economic prosperity, and has always been seen as a threat to the status quo, a threat to white supremacy, and it continues to be understood from that particular light. So that's one thing that's really, really important. And I think also, so Black economic prosperity is a target, right? And so we have to really understand and recognize that. I think what's also important is if we look at those people who come to Tulsa by 1910, 1912, it is an emerging and developing district. And then we know what happens in 1921. African Americans who migrate, right? And it's important to sort of understand Black migration. Black people who migrate to the West during the exodusters back into the 1870s. These are all Black towns, and these places in Oklahoma, right? The emergence of Oklahoma statehood in 1907. They're ultimately looking at Black economic power as a way to reach the fullest extent of their ideals of freedom, right? African Americans are going from place to place in a lot of ways. We look at the Great Migration, World War I, World War II, post-World War II, and then reverse migration. Black people are looking for freedom, right? In its truest sense. And part of the ways in which they pursue that freedom is through their economic independence, right? But I think it's also important to note that within the confines of capitalism, it's important to know the limitations of capitalism. In other words, economic, a focus on economic or capitalism isn't a salve necessarily for what we're wanting in terms of our freedoms. And so I think sometimes that we are too closely aligned to understanding our freedom in terms of how much money we're able to get, right, from that particular standpoint.
That, and because one of the things I always tell people in this work is like, we're not in the business of trading one oppressor for the next, right? Like, we have to be able to create these new innovative solutions. And so I appreciate you saying that. And so I want to bring in Kenya into this conversation and talk to you about your work at the Black Massacre Project, right? So through the Black Massacre Project, you've been documenting numerous thriving Black communities beyond Tulsa. Can you share your insights into these communities' economic strategies and how their stories inform our understanding of historical financial racism? You're on mute.
I promise you I clicked the button. I promise you I did. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you this evening, and I'm grateful to be here with the distinguished panelists. I did want to take an opportunity to point to some examples of the types of communities that we study at the Black Massacre Project, particularly those that were thriving economically. And I think even though we had like a little pre-meeting, we really didn't talk through a lot of what we would discuss today as panelists, but we were apparently aligned because two of the places that I really wanted to focus on in this quick response here are those that are related to Magdalena Walker and John Hervey Wheeler. And so that's very fortuitous. So you've heard the two panelists talk about them and their work and their acts. And what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the places that where they lived in the economic environment and just the environment in general, where they were. And I know that there are just a number of people, in part due to popular culture, that know about Tulsa and Tulsa's Greenwood district. And we've seen that that group of people who know about the Tulsa Massacre. But there were just a number of places that experienced very similar situations. And of course, with Tulsa, you're talking about a situation where you have over 600 Black businesses, all within, like 35 square blocks, 34, 35 square blocks. And so it's no wonder that people really know that legacy, and that legacy has persisted over time. But there really are just quite a number of incredibly successful Black towns and communities that existed before and after Tulsa, and even some that have rivaled or even surpassed the economic progress of the Greenwood community. And so I thought I would start with the one in my hometown, my home state of North Carolina. And that's the one in Durham, North Carolina. And so that works out. That's a great transition. And this particular community was called the Hayti community. And it was really this mecca for Black entrepreneurship. And I had the pleasure of spending some of my formative years living in Durham, North Carolina. And so some of the things that I'll talk about and some of the things I'm sure we'll discuss throughout the panel, I've been able to kind of experience myself. And it really just kind of speaks to the way that we've been able to create these institutions and how these institutions have lasted the test of time in some ways, and those that went disrupted. And so I'll talk a little bit about that disruption as well. But when you think about the Hayti community, it was founded shortly after the end of the Civil War. And there were well over 200 Black businesses there. There were schools and barbershops and all the things they talk about when we talk about Tulsa, the movie theaters and the hotels, and of course an HBCU. And it was also known for the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, which was one of the largest Black-owned insurance companies in this country. And, again, when you talk about, or when you think about how we're able to create these institutions and how when they aren't disrupted, they last a very long time and they sustain themselves. I think that North Carolina Mutual would be an example of that. It was founded in 1898 and it, started going through the liquidation process in 2022. And so even though that was, part of the heart of the Hayti community back in the late 1800s, I myself have been to the building where, the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company still stands. And so, it's really just kind of a testament to what Black folks can do when unhindered. And so there was that. There was, of course, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank that Dr. Brandon just talked about. And one of the other things about, this community that I think is really unique is in some literature, it kind of holds the distinction as being the first all Black community that was fully self-sufficient, right? And so, we talk about Tulsa, we talk about Rosewood and all these other communities, but this, we don't necessarily talk about these. And this is one of the things that the Black Massacre Project strives to do, not only unearth those stories, but also make sure that we get the information out to people who can use it for a number of different reasons. And I think we'll kind of talk a little bit about that a little later. But one thing I will say, and I want to talk not only about the vibrance of these very few examples that I'm going to provide, we'll talk about the vibrance, but we'll also talk about the downfall of some of these communities. And in this case, one of the major issues that caused the downfall of this particular community is the construction of the Durham Freeway. And that happened in the 1950s. And so that freeway destroyed most of that community. And it was just, it was a tremendous impact on that community. That highway, or that freeway rather, displaced over 4,000 families and 500 businesses. And so that just kind of gives you an idea of the magnitude of, number one, the impact that these communities had on those cities and the states, but also how the dismantling of those communities impacted Black families and how that dismantling contributed to the economic issues in those families as well. But I just want to give you little snippets because we got a long way to go and lots of thoughts and not a lot of time. I do want to, but I could not talk to you this evening without talking about the Jackson Ward, right? And the Jackson Ward was located in Richmond, Virginia. I did see in the comments that there are a few folks from Virginia, so good to see you there. And, a lot of people consider Richmond, Virginia, the Jackson Ward to be the first Black Wall Street. And it's so ironic because when you think about the Black Wall Street, or Black Wall Street rather, most people think about Tulsa. And, the reality is there were, quite a few Black Wall Streets. Tulsa wasn't the first, and it wasn't the biggest, and it wasn't the most developed, but it is certainly the one that we know the most about. And so this is an opportunity to really kind of learn about all of the economic growth and prosperity that existed in these other communities across the United States. And so not only was it, labeled the first Black Wall Street, it was also kind of known as the Harlem of the South. So if you think about what we now know Atlanta to be today, like an entertainment capital, that's kind of what Richmond, Virginia was back in the day. And it's kind of hard to imagine, the Richmond that we know today to be that, but it really was this financial and cultural epicenter. And we know that in terms of its financial and economic status, one of the reasons that they are regarded as such is because of Maggie Lena Walker. And as Stefan mentioned at the top of the hour, she was not only the first Black woman to charter and lead a bank in the United States, she was the first woman and held a number of different businesses and enterprises. And, even when you travel to Richmond today, or those of you that are in Richmond, her house has become a National Historic Site for that reason. And, just the powerful work that she did in that environment. And again, I want to tell you about the demise of all of these communities, even though there are remnants, of course, of all of these. But, like many of the other vibrant Black communities that existed at the time, and even some today, urban renewal and highway projects really played a part in the demise of this particular community. And in this case, I think it was the Richmond Peterson Turnpike. So there's a theme that we see emerging here, and we're going to look at the ways that not only white supremacists and angry white mobs have played a role in the destruction of these communities. A lot of this stuff was state sanctioned violence. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And so we've talked about some places that at the time were relatively urban, but I did want to say just a word about a rural environment that was considered to be an economic hub. And hopefully many of you are familiar with the Rosewood, Florida community, right? And so, Rosewood, Florida, it's not a big city. I've been there a couple of times, and it certainly, it wasn't a big city then. It continues to not be an urban hub at this point, but it certainly was considered to be an economic powerhouse at the time. It was a self-sufficient community, and the folks in that town, in that community, were well known in South Florida, and they were dominating certain fields. They were dominating turpentine and the logging industry, and members of that community actually owned a turpentine mill, a sugarcane mill. They even owned a baseball team. And so they were doing all these things at a time when they were even more so than the economic, the communities in places like Richmond and Philadelphia and New York, where they were dealing with slightly different variables as related to Jim Crow and Black codes and anti-Black discriminatory legislation. So they were in many ways in the thick of things, right? And so even despite all of those challenges, they maintained themselves as an economic force in that region. And, just as a testament to that, I work with the folks in Rosewood, the descendants of the Rosewood Massacre. And one of the things they talk about is the fact that many of the people in that community, and we're talking about the turn, like the early 1900s, and even at the turn of the century, they were living in two-story homes. And that may not sound like a big deal today, but that's just something that was very rare for any family at the time, let alone Black families. And so what you're seeing with this is a community that has this outward uh, appearance of wealth and economic sustainability. And so we saw that in Rosewood, but we also saw it in Tulsa. And the really interesting thing about all of these stories that we researched through the Black Massacre Project is that, we're often told when we do know about these stories that the destruction of these cities and communities and towns was the result of an interracial relationship or an interracial dispute. But the reality is, when you went to Rosewood, when you went to Tulsa, the Greenwood community, as a non-Black person, you were inundated with this economic stability that really wasn't taking place in those places for white people. And so you had white people who were having to see this Black wealth and this Black growth, and it created tensions within those communities that led to these mobs, these angry white mobs, destroying not only the businesses and the homes, killing people, but also, just kind of running people away. And a testament of that is in Rosewood, there's currently one Black person who owns property in Rosewood to this day. And this happened 102 years ago or 103 years ago, right? And so, the point is, there are lots of Black Wall Streets in America. I could name probably another 20 of them. Some of you, I took a look at the comment section. So there's some of you in Chicago, Brownswood section of Chicago. There's Sweet Auburn in Atlanta. There's Farish District in Jackson, Mississippi, Black Bottom in Detroit. These are some of the places I see in the audience here. There are a lot of them. But the reality is that, they had one thing in common. Most of them were self-sufficient, and they were destroyed because of the economic power that they had. And the only other thing I'll say, because I don't want to take up too much time, is, there is definitely a blueprint here. And that's one of the reasons that we study Black massacres, and why a lot of people are doing the work around just kind of unearthing these stories. There's a blueprint. And I would even go so far to say a nationwide conspiracy to destroy and undermine these communities and the economies that supported them.
That and got a quick follow-up for you, right? So how do you see these historical events connecting to current economic disparities? Like, how can this understanding inform reparative justice initiatives, in the country? Like, there's something called climate reparations now that people are talking about, but you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a massive connection between the destruction of these Black economic centers across the last, 200 years practically, and the economic disparities that exist today, and that have, quite frankly, kind of marked the history of Black people in this country. I mean, and the bottom line is, structural racism, right? But if I were to just kind of expand on that a little bit, these communities were systematically rather stripped of their wealth and economic mobility. I mean, it was very intentional. It was very deliberate. And, even kind of based on the examples that I just mentioned, they were all destroyed by some type of state-sanctioned violence. It doesn't matter if it was a white mob, if it was the KKK, if it was a highway. It was a type of state-sanctioned violence, whether it was, urban renewal or highway development. All of that was not only sanctioned and approved, but many times initiated by either the federal or state government, right? And so that's really important to think about as we think about where we are today, particularly in this political environment. And, as much as we've been exposed to the Tulsa Massacre, that's the one that people know so much about. It's really interesting to think about the fact that most people aren't even aware of the fact that while a ton of people left Tulsa after the massacre, and rightfully so, many Black Tulsans stayed and rebuilt Black Wall Street. And that's a part of the history that people, I don't think, really know a lot about or even knew existed to begin with. And just to kind of give you an illustration of that, the Tulsa Massacre took place on May 31st. And by December, of that year, 760 of the roughly 1,300 houses that were destroyed were already rebuilt. They had already rebuilt more than half of the houses that were there the same year of the massacre. And this is after living in tents on that property for months at a time. By the fall of 1922, many of the businesses that existed in Black Wall Street had already been rebuilt, including the Dreamwood Theater, which is the one that most people popularly know, the one that shows up in popular culture. So they were rebuilt. And by the late 1920s, the Greenwood community was basically back to being Black Wall Street. But it wasn't the massacre that destroyed Black Wall Street or the Greenwood community. It wasn't that at all. It was urban development, right? It wasn't, the community was destroyed, they rebuilt it, and then because of the Federal Aid Highway Acts of 1965 and 68, that community was sliced right up. There's a highway through it and it was paved over, right? And that is the case with a number of different Black communities. And so, while there are a number of issues that connect the historical destruction of these types of communities to the economic disparity that we're currently experiencing in Black America and have, over the years, like Jim Crow and segregation, and even like exclusion from the marketplace. It really was this government-driven displacement, state-sanctioned violence that arguably has had the most significant impact on our economics thus far.
Thank you for that. And I hope everybody is enjoying this conversation so far. Like, it's really fascinating to really uncover these things. And so, I told you that we have two more segments that I want to talk about. We're going to talk about the modern challenges and opportunities. And then we're going to end it when you're talking about the connection to the past to the present, right? And so to talk about these modern challenges and opportunity, Shennette, I'd like to ask you, like, in your upcoming book about Black enterprise and how racial capitalism made America, how do you see historical patterns of racial capitalism influencing modern financial activism?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in my book, I spend quite a bit of time talking about a few, actually, some few white folks in my book, but mostly African Americans. And so what I really try to talk about is the ways in which African Americans took advantage of this segregated economy in order to build wealth, but also constantly pushing home a message of the ways in which they were also undermined, because of the kind of barriers that they faced. And so I, if I just think about, connections to today, some of the things, one of the big things I talk about in my book is that there's just this entrepreneurial energy. It's not just sweeping, through Black communities. It's like in the DNA. I mean, it's like in the sinews, in the blood. So this is not something new. And entrepreneurship, to kind of echo, Dr. Winford Brandon, is it's entrepreneurship and finance and investment are part of a multi-pronged, freedom strategy. And people are using their businesses, they're using banks. And when we've just really talked about like formal banks, but there are all kinds of financial institutions that are making a rich, tapestry, in Black communities. You've got, insurance companies, you've got thrift clubs, building and loans, investment clubs, rotating credit associations, credit unions. So we talk about the 130 plus, banks that were, created in the, before the Great Depression, but really there are thousands of, Black financial institutions, institutions, and because they are locked out of mainstream, U.S. financial systems, they kind of exist in this parallel financial world. And because of the, the circumstances under which they're forced to work, they have to be dynamic. They have to be innovative. And we see them mixing, formal institutions like these finance companies and investment companies with, more precarious, maybe questionable ventures that just skirt the law, to just being outright illegal. But the important thing to note is that African Americans are drawing on, the resources of their community. We're seeing not just elite, super educated folks, but through, across the class spectrum, men and women of all kinds of backgrounds are being industrious, looking, to make progress. They're seeking their nest eggs. They are, dreamers too. And so just to kind of piggyback quickly. So one of the things that I really, really stress is I really do stress the role of violence. And as Kenya was mentioning about the sanctioned, state violence, which I kind of call this bloodless, bureaucratic violence of slum clearance, like she mentioned, urban renewal, highway expansion, gentrification. But also I do also in this book try to talk about, when we talk about those white mobs, these are, deacons, police officers, sheriffs, politicians, the white business civic elite. It's just I really try to highlight the ways in which, sometimes we think about this kind of lawless mob, but these are whole communities aligning against, Black enterprise. And it's unfortunate that, African Americans have had to deal with the aftermath of this violence. But, unfortunately, it's been a long part of Black financial innovation. And so the last thing too in this book, I said I do mention a few white folks, and so I, in the Carnegie's in my, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, both Rockefellers, John Sr. and John Jr., Rosenwald. I mean, so there, and I highlight them to show the ways in which, African American entrepreneurs and investors, try to seek alliance with mainstream, titans of capital, but it was their limited vision. It was the limited vision of those, potential white partners that continue to undermine Black business. And so I think the lesson today, the kind of connection today is that, in seeking these alliances, that we just have to continue to push past their limited visions of Black freedom, ask for more accountability for the ways in which these, organizations, these banks in particular have created the very conditions, with that they are, holding against African American communities as to why they can't invest more or why, there's more risk here. So, thinking about, learning from the limitations of past attempts to find allies and pushing, kind of current, efforts to just have a much more expansive vision, of Black, economic freedom. And then the very last thing I'll say is also thinking about, what Brandon said, the enterprise isn't necessarily, the solution. I always say, can free enterprise make you free? No, but it doesn't mean that African Americans haven't tried to carve out opportunity. And again, like he said, it's just one strategy among a multi-pronged strategy to realize these Black freedom dreams. So I think that's the connection.
Thank you so much for that. And Brandon, I want to ask you, your current work covers this comprehensive history of Black banking in the New South since 1865. What surprising continuities or like changes have you observed in the challenges and strategies of Black-owned banks from Reconstruction to like today?
I think that's a really, really good question. I think, well, part of the conversation about Black-owned banks throughout their history, part of some of the conversation with historians is that these banking institutions were not enough because historically their resources have been very, very limited, right? When we compare them to the broader realm of banking within the United States. For example, during World War II, there are about 15,000 banks operating in the United States. About 11, and then directly after World War II, about 13 Black-owned banks in operation. Out of those 15,000 banks, $176 billion in resources compared to those Black banks, 13 Black banks, 11 to 13 Black banks during and after World War II, roughly $30 million in resources. And so comparatively speaking, right, we have to understand when we talk about continuities, we have to understand the identities of Black-owned banks throughout their existence. And I think one of the things that's important, especially when we think of sort of the moment of integration, right, in the 60s and 70s, when Black institutions writ large, schools, so forth and so on, in many ways are abandoned in a lot of ways. These institutions, like the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, are at a turning point where they have to think about where African Americans their consumer base stands in comparison to tapping back into that larger marketplace. And for many of them, like North Carolina Mutual, they in many ways try to pivot beyond just being a Black-owned insurance company. The Citizens Trust Bank in Atlanta, Georgia, right? By the late 1960s, they built this big corporate office and are succeeding to a large degree. And Lauren Milton, who's the president, he's thinking about tapping into this broader market in Atlanta and in Georgia, right? By the mid 1970s, they have to bring in a new president because they're at the cusp of closure, right? They bring in Elon Funderburg, who had been a corporate executive with the Mechanics Farmers Bank for about 20 years. He goes and becomes the CEO of the Gateway National Bank in St. Louis. And so they bring in this veteran banker who kind of brings them back from the brink. And so I think it's important to think about, especially in our contemporary moment, we think about Black institutions and Black businesses in particular, we have to really think about their identities in terms of their relationship to their consumer base, and really sort of reassert what that relationship is going to be, right? And I'll just give you an example. During COVID, the Mechanics Farmers Bank, they re-engaged their sort of focus on as a community institution. And so they sought to provide their customers with whether it's training to help them understand, things like the Care Fund Act and so forth and so on. So I think when I think about sort of these continuities, understanding the some of the historic, I don't want to say limitations, but generally speaking, the resources and their identity and their relationship to Black communities has to be something that has been asserted, and that's something I see in terms of the continuity, which I think is really, really important. But I think also we have to also understand historically the lack of access to capital for Black-owned banks, other kinds of Black businesses, that has prohibited African Americans from tapping into a broader sector, right? And early in the 20th century, it's like the manufacturing sector. In our contemporary moment, there are challenges with Black startups who have very solid proposals being denied funding in the face of their white counterparts who barely even have an idea, right? And so I think those are some of the things that are really, really important to sort of how we understand these sort of continuities. I think in the 21st century, again, a reassertion of what their identities are going to be and what's the relationship to the Black consumer base, which has always been triumphed as an important in terms of the Black buying power and so forth.
I appreciate that. In Kenya, as someone with extensive experience in criminal justice reform and now leading strategic initiatives at Dartmouth, how do you see the role of higher education in addressing historical and ongoing economic injustices faced by Black communities?
Push the button this time. That's good. Off to a roaring start. But I think that while we can all agree that there's just a number of different pathways to success, that education has been one of the greatest equalizers in our society for Black folks in this country, specifically higher ed. And I would say, higher ed has been responsible for the social mobility of generations of Black families at this point. And I do think that higher ed absolutely has a role in addressing economic injustice for our communities. And, first thing I'll say is, the obvious. First thing, it's the education itself, right? And so, there is that substantive learning. You want to be an accountant, you got to learn how to, you go to school and you become an accountant. You want to know how to be an engineer, you have to go and take substantive courses to become an engineer, right? There's that. But it really gives you a really and truly unique opportunity to learn more about yourself and about others. And I can just say for myself, the one place that I did not mention in my first response was my hometown, which is Wilmington, North Carolina. While not exactly like Tulsa or Rosewood or Durham, it was a place that had a thriving Black community in the late 1800s, right? There was, economic opportunity there for Black people, political opportunity. There were freedmen who held public office before the end of slavery. And at one point, Black people in that community were more literate than white people, right? But here's the thing, all of this wonderful stuff existed in that space. I grew up there, the child of activists, the grandchild of activists. And I can tell you that I never learned a single thing about the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, which was what ultimately kind of destroyed that economic success in that community until I got to college. And it was something that I learned. I attended an historically Black college, Winston-Salem State University. And those were the things that I learned, not only about Tulsa and Rosewood, but also my own community. And so it gives people an opportunity to learn about themselves and others. And why is that important? Why do we need to know about ourselves? Why do we need to know about others? I mean, and the reason in this particular context that it's helpful to know about these things is because, most oppression is systemic in nature, right? These people who are hell-bent on oppressing communities and groups of people and even countries, they're not the most innovative. They keep doing the same things over and over again. They're following a blueprint. And if you look at the blueprint that's used in 2025 to oppress, it's very similar to the blueprint that was used in 1725, in 1825, and in 1925. I mean, that's simply what it is. And so you have the ability to not only learn about the economic injustice of like a Tulsa or your hometown, or some place that you've learned about, but you also have the opportunity to learn about and think about other marginalized communities, not only here in the US, but abroad. And you get the opportunity to study patterns and cycles. And those are the things that I think are really going to help us to move out of this space. And so there is, education for the sake of education. But beyond that, I do believe that, higher education has a role to play in Black communities as well, and not just for the students that attend. We know that many universities are located in what were previously Black communities or current Black communities. And some of those are anchor institutions, right? It's the place that kind of centers that that neighborhood, that city. And there are a few of those, but not as many of them as there should be. And it is my belief, as a person who's been working in higher ed for more time than I'd love to admit, that these institutions should really be investing in the communities that they're in, as well as the people that live in those communities, regardless of whether they're students or not. And that may sound like a handout to some folks. Why should a university be responsible for the people that are around it? And I'm here to tell you that, this is a consideration that happens in predominantly white institutions all the time, right? So, when we think about, majority institutions, there's something called town gown relations. And it's, town like the town you live in, gown like a graduation gown, town gown relations. And when you think about town gown relations, it's something that, it's a concept that explores the relationship between the university that's in that community and the people and businesses that are surrounding that university, right? And many universities, prominent universities, belong to these town gown associations where they are, where that school and that community are kind of like working together to identify ways to not only coexist, but actually support each other. And so, universities are economic drivers of the communities that they're in, right? There are, businesses, there are banks, there's real estate. There are all of these entities that exist around universities for the sake of supporting, the people that are either working or living on those university campuses or studying on those university campuses. And so, there has to be an exchange between that university and the community where it's situated. And there are a lot of institutions that are in, the whitest, smallest towns in America who are actively thinking about how they can economically support the community where that university is located. And what I find is that doesn't always happen when that university is situated in a Black community or a previously, a community that was previously Black. And so what does that support look like, right? So of course there are towns or universities where there are special like scholarships and stuff for people who are local to that institution. But there are other things that they can do. There are entrepreneurship programs. And so and with one of my other hats on, I do a lot of work in India. And one of the things that I really kind of admire about the universities in India is that almost all of them have a entrepreneur program, right? That's kind of like exists within the university. And any person on the street can walk into the Center for Entrepreneurship and say, I have a great idea. And if that idea is workable, if it makes sense, typically that university, that center will get behind that idea, right? Whereas in the United States, typically speaking, we reserve the best of our institutions for the people who are paying into those institutions. And if we were to open it up and provide people in community with the opportunity to take advantage of the resources that are available at these institutions, I think that would be a way to really kind of enhance not only what's happening at the university, but also in those communities. The other thing that's a little bit more radical is like land repatriation. We know that a lot of these institutions, maybe some of the ones that you went to, are situated where they are because of eminent domain or some other mechanism to pull poor people out of their houses to make way for the university. And we see university crawl, how at one point the college is 10 blocks and now it's 50 blocks. And who are the people who are the most impacted by that? It's usually people in poorer communities. And so giving that land back, I think, is a viable idea. And finally, as a final thing I'll say, but just quickly as it relates to criminal justice reform, I have worked in that space for a couple of decades. I think we know that there's probably everybody knows this, suspects that there's a correlation between access to education and, those antisocial behaviors that often lead to some type of criminal activity. I will say that education, in particular, higher education, tends to disrupt criminal patterns. And so while it's true that you can't eat your diploma and books won't keep you warm at night unless you're burning them, but individuals who are educated or in the process of getting educated are less likely to commit crime. So I do think that universities really should be more anchored in communities and really consider not only economically, but in other ways, the life experiences and conditions of the people who are living around them.
I appreciate that. And before we get to this last segment of talking about connecting the past to the present, I just wanted to have a quick question for you all, right? Like, so at Hip Hop Caucus, like, we have our Bank Black and Green campaign, and we're trying to create this new shared vision about like what's possible when we change the banking industry for good, right? Like shifting our mindsets around this conversation. And part of it is creating this vision about how do we reinvest in our communities and leverage these financial institutions that we've been talking about. So my question to you guys is like, just if it can be really quick, if you're saying like, what innovative strategies do you think that we should consider to ensure that these efforts to reinvest in our community are long-term systemic change? And anybody can chime in. One of those big questions, right? You're like, man, like, what is it? Like, I guess the easier way for me to say is like, what do you think when you think about investing in the public health and safety of our communities? What comes up for you naturally?
I was about to type, you go, Brandon. In terms of innovative strategies, one that I was, going to mention, toward the end, but I'll mention it here is, and I'll expound on it later, is just the innovative ways that Black financial institutions determined credit. And I'll be more specific, in the next session, because when I think about so I write about the St. Luke Bank, Magdalena Walker, Lillian Payne, the women who were on the finance committee having to make decisions about where to put the bank's money, well, really was the people's money that they put in the bank. They were operating in a world that didn't see anything virtuous about Black women, that assumed that African Americans were less intelligent, didn't know how to save money, were risky in every sense of the word risk. And so one of the things that I think that these one of their innovations was, in really, trying to understand risk, credit worthiness, what does that really mean? And really innovating some, strategies for how to measure, give a true measure, of a person and their potential outside of these narratives and these discourses that are already denigrating Blackness, womanness, Southernness, all these kind of different, indexes of, Black people's identities. So I'll talk a little bit more, later, because I spent, more than a decade in the mortgage industry before I became a professor. And so even today, I see some ways in which the lessons of some of these banks, in terms of, giving people more access, they offer some really great lessons and strategies.
Anybody else have any thoughts, or because I do got another question for y'all.
I was going to kind of point out some of what Shennette writes about in her book, these various financial strategies that banks like St. Luke Penny Savings Bank use. In other words, what she's really talking about is understanding the kind of the constituencies, those depositors, understanding their circumstances, the conditions that place them in, oppressive situations, and not using that against them when making decisions in terms of credit, in terms of risk, and so forth and so on. So I think really sort of understanding one's relationship to, whether we're talking about clientele, and understanding those circumstances and moving on that basis, right? I think that's really, really important. And I think sometimes, I always say that a lot of times we think and believe that, from an economic standpoint, that we're not doing as much as we are, right? And so there are plenty of examples that we can use in Atlanta, for example, right? There are folks who write about Black entrepreneurship, and they list those Black entrepreneurs in those communities and provide you with the kind of framework of how to support, right? And so as you look within your local communities, right, do a Google search and type in Black entrepreneurship in Philadelphia, Black entrepreneurship in Houston, Black entrepreneurship in Memphis. And I would venture to say that you're going to get some understanding and clarity on what kind of businesses, Black-owned businesses, are in operation. But there are a lot of sort of economic development nonprofits and/or a lot of the universities. Kenya mentioned some of the universities, and I'll just use, Spelman and Morehouse. There is the Center for Black Entrepreneurship, and they team up with, I forget the economic development organization there. And so there are a lot of ways in which those kind of entities sort of come together in a trying to really sort of think about and come up with innovations in entrepreneurship. And I also have a kind of investment component to it. In the chat, I pointed to the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. There are hundreds of public policy papers where they have economists, they have historians, all working on issues, whether it's Black business in a particular city in COVID, whether it's on Black Wall Street. And, sometimes we kind of don't pay attention to what us academics are doing, but they bring in activists, right? These are all of the people who are part of collaborating on these particular issues. So they're thinking about a sort of idea, and they're bringing some practical solutions to these problems. They're also talking in many of these policy papers, they're talking to people on the ground, right? In terms of this, whether some of their data is coming from. So I would encourage you to do some of that, right? So those are some of the things that I think are really, really important. We sometimes we say that we don't read. We read. Look at all these people on this call who are interested in our works, interested in some of the ways in which they can gain certain kinds of insights and sort of bring it together with what how you're already thinking. And then the last thing I'll say is that formal education, one of the things that we know about these early pioneers in business, formal education in business, in other words, being trained as business people, was not a prerequisite for them to take on the levels and the kinds of business sectors that they had no experience in, right? And so I think sometimes if we don't have a degree in X, Y, and Z, if we don't, then we're a little hesitant, right, to move forward with some of the ideas we have because we don't have the formal training. And I think that's one of the things that we should kind of put aside, right, in this particular moment, not to discount the formal training. I think it's important, but I think sometimes we limit our capacity because we're so focused on, well, if I don't have a degree in this, I can't do that. These are preachers, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're domestics, they're washerwomen, they're cooks. These are the people who established and started these financial institutions in the late 19th and 20th century. They're part of these fraternal organizations and mutual aid societies. They are the driving force in trying to make sure that Black economic life has a future. And I think that's some of what we can sort of take from this conversation as well.
I truly appreciate this. if you guys, I do have one quick last question. If anybody just wants to answer, this is like, how do you see financial activism intersecting with this broader movement of reparative justice during this critical moment in history that we're in? If anybody wants to take that question.
Yeah, I'll hop in here. I mean, to a certain extent, I don't think it's a intersection. I think it's a direct correlation, right? Because first and foremost, I mean, we are still in the midst of a very robust reparations movement, and so, and when I say reparations, I don't just mean for American slavery. It's not just about American slavery. It's about Jim Crow. It's about all of the anti-Black legislation and policy and activity that happened. And so, yes, when you think about the slavery that happened some time ago, although not that long ago, right? But from a legal perspective, your statute of limitations is not what's going to drive these claims because it happened so long ago. But there are reparations for education. There's someone at Columbia who's doing tremendous work, Dr. Bettina Love, around educational reparations and the ways that we underfund majority Black schools and sometimes Black students. There are states that are participating in reparations work, right? And so I think that that's something that's currently happening. And while there may not be a ton of progress on the federal landscape around reparations, particularly with this administration, I do think that there are a number of states, cities, communities, and industries that are making progress as it relates to reparations. And so there's that, and then there's always the old adage that you put your money where your mouth is. And so we've seen the tactics that our aunties and grandparents and great grandparents used during the civil rights movement to kind of push things along and move things along. And boycotts and strikes and really just being very intentional about how and where we spend our money. And I think that there's while we're still doing that to a certain extent, I think that the convenience and technology make it a lot easier to still, shop at you fill in the blank or still go and patronize this restaurant, right? Because it's so easy to get to things, and it's also easy to forget. But I think that we absolutely can use that as a strategy to shift public policy, to even shift the way that the justice reform is going at this moment, and in a number of different areas. So we have that power. We really just need to refocus on harnessing it and being intentional about where we, put our emphasis.
I appreciate that, and thank you for that segment of this conversation. We're last part, and we're talking about connecting the past to the present. And so, Shennette, I want to ask you this question of saying, as we celebrate Black History Month, how can the lessons from early Black-owned financial institutions inform our approach to addressing like wealth disparities and promoting economic justice today?
Yeah, this is where I thought I might get a little bit more specific. So, the St. Luke Bank in particular, I mean, it was built around the working women who, funded and, who used that bank and, and their families. So, it stayed late because, these women worked late, for example. But as, having been in the mortgage industry, and my husband is still in the mortgage industry, even now with like credit scores, which we don't really understand, the companies kind of keep them really secret about how they constitute your score. And they claim to be colorblind, like that they have nothing to do with race. But as soon as someone, pretty much knows your zip code, they may have a clue. There's some clues, and then there's some other, I think, kind of, patterns, among, Black people in credit that I think it kind of becomes really, clear and apparent when you have people of color, who are attempting to, to get credit. And so some of the lessons that we can really learn is to, look at kind of the whole person. So for example, something that they sometimes call compensating factors, instead of actually, like increasing people's risk, it actually is kind of lowering it. So, a person may not have, some of the examples, people, if you pay tithes, you pay your rent on time, if you're, are paying your, gym membership, but gym membership, how long people have been in, on their jobs, so there are other ways to look at the whole person and the ways in which they spend, invest, save, beyond just that credit score that should be taken into account. And also, I think too, there needs to be a just much more frank conversation about we've heard about like algorithmic racism and things like that, and really admitting that given the kind of systemic nature of racist oppression in this country, that there's no system that does not have within it the kind of tendrils of racism. And if these kind of financial institutions are just more open about the fact that some of these legacies of Jim Crow and slavery are still embedded in these financial institutions, so let's be more expansive and imaginative about the ways in which we look at people and look at their lives and look at the ways that they have handled money, and and work to try to incorporate that, more into, the frameworks of these institutions. And then the last thing too, I'll say too, is, Bank Black is still real. Everybody needs to have, some money, put into, a Black owned bank. Or a credit union. And I think that not just spending our money in alignment with our values, but where we park our money in alignment with our values is kind of really important in some of the important lessons from these early Black-owned financial institutions that can inform our approaches to addressing disparities and promoting economic justice for ourselves and our communities.
For you, how do you think understanding the like successful Black financial districts can help inspire and inform current efforts to build Black economic power?
That's, to me, you kind of froze up a little bit.
Yes, sir.
Well, one of the things I think is important, we talk about Black Wall Streets, plural, right, all across the country. Richmond, Atlanta, Durham, Memphis, Birmingham, so on and so forth. I think it's important, especially when we're connecting what it means to be a Black Wall Street, right? What it meant to be a Black Wall Street was that there were tangible features, and everybody has spoke to these. There's financial institutions, right? We look at all these places, there are real financial institutions. And I think also we need to start rethinking the idea of Black Wall Street, because it has those connotations to Wall Street. In Durham, it was also the Hayti community where many of the businesses and retail and residents were. But then there was also Parish Street, where the Kansas Farmers Bank, the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company operated, right? Auburn Avenue. So I also think we need to be reassert, and also in some ways think, go away from the Wall Street notion of how we sort of represent these particular communities. But I think, in terms of those tangible features, financial institutions, In many instances, there was an institution of higher education. There was a significant residential district, like Jackson Ward and so forth. There, in many of these cases, in Richmond and Durham, there was a industry that, although they worked in the lowest paid and lowest rungs of those jobs, much of their pay and wages were better than, say, agricultural work and so forth, right? So in Richmond and Durham, there's tobacco, right? Then there were community leaders and organizations, whether we're talking about these fraternal and mutual aid societies, that ran the gamut, was a cross section of Black leadership, whether we're talking about from the labor sector or so forth. And so when we talk about Black Wall Streets, those tangible features were very much present. And I think sometimes we attach ourselves to the symbolic nature of what it meant to be a Black Wall Street. In other words, we say that wherever there's a Black business or so forth, Black Wall Street, right? It's symbolic. The Greenwood Bank, right? Even though there wasn't a bank in Greenwood, the symbolic nature of it being a Wall Street or Black Wall Street is there. But I think sometimes we need to, symbolism is important, but we also need to think about the ways in which these were real and tangible Black business sectors, right, that afforded African Americans access to an economy or access to various kinds of businesses that they were otherwise excluded from. And so I think some of the lessons is to think about the ways in which our collective sensibilities, right? I think sometimes individualism within our society, especially when we think about our identity as Americans, and the realities of capitalism is in many ways can be individualistic as opposed to these collective interests, whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about economic interests and so forth. And so I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I think we have to really sort of understand the dynamics that were at work, and also think about the ways in which we can reimagine also what community is, right? So I'll just stop right there. But those are some of the ways in which I kind of think about, right, what we can sort of take from these Black business sectors or these Black financial sectors.
That was perfect. I appreciate it. And Kenya, the question I have for you is, right, like your background like spans like so many places, right? Like law, criminal justice, the arts. Like, and so how do you integrate these like diverse perspectives when addressing these issues of economic justice and financial activism? Like, like we're in Black History Month. Like tell me a little bit about that. How you bring your full self to this.
Yes, well, anybody who knows me knows that it is Black History Month every month. So there's that. There's no deviation in Florida. I mean, in February. But what I will say as it relates to law and criminal justice, I mean, those topics, those issues are really just integral to the conversation around, the struggle for economic justice and activism, because, anti-Black legislation and policy have been what has driven this country from its inception and even before its inception. It was our servitude and degradation that have been critical, really, like, to the success of this country. And, even though we have at various points in this country provided white people with reparations for the loss of our labor, in some ways it feels like, this society is trying to get back to that. It's kind of like, you lose when you have cash in your wallet and you take it out to buy something and you lose $100 and you go around for the next couple of weeks trying to figure out how to make it all add up to everything you had in your wallet before you lost that $100. Sometimes it feels like, what's happening in this country, like they lost Black folks' labor, right? And they're always trying to figure out a way to make up for the loss of that labor. And we've seen it manifest in lots of different ways, whether it's, outsourcing, businesses and tasks to other countries where they can pay people, 6 cents an hour, or most relevantly to law and criminal justice, outsourcing things to our prison systems, right? Both private and public. And so there's always this desire to, increase the amount of revenue that's happening. And it feels like we just haven't been right since we lost that free labor as a country. And so when we have any kind of conversation as it relates to economic justice and financial activism, we have to think about how the legal system plays into that, right? Because we know that all of these institutions in our country where whether we're talking about higher education, the criminal justice system, all of these things, these are businesses. And so if you don't have a client, you ain't got a business. So, we can't really separate those things. We have to consistently think about how this fight for economic justice in this country, impacts people who are incarcerated, who impacts people who are justice affected, right? Why do we have, why has this sprung up into such a huge industry where, like for a time we were filling prisons, and then the prisons, were full. And so, finally we said, oh yeah, we'll do private prisons. And then that became, we ran out of space there. And now it's like, okay, we'll just put an ankle monitor on you and charge you for that monitor every single month. And if you cannot pay those fees, then you have to go back to prison, not because you've committed a crime, but because you cannot keep up with, the economic aspects of that punishment, right? And so looking at the collateral consequences of incarceration, the fact that you can commit a crime and 20 years later, you still can't stay at an Airbnb, you still can't rent an apartment, you still can't get federal aid or whatever the cases may be, right? And so these things are really kind of like intertwined. You cannot, I do not believe that you can separate them. And just as it relates to the arts, as an artist, I've always found a home in my activism and advocacy as it relates to art. And at the Black Massacre Project, we often integrate art into our initiatives, and we often collaborate with visual artists and musicians, and absolutely collaborate with filmmakers to share our work. And even in the research that we conduct, we've leaned on music and visual art and even prose to gain an understanding of this country's Black massacres, because so many of the written accounts of these massacres, the few that exist, are written from the oppressor's perspective, right? People who were actually responsible for that carnage. That also takes in consideration, the fact that during the time of many of these massacres, many of us were illiterate, unable to access the tools to memorialize those stories. We think about if we want to tell a story, if we want to write something down or memorialize something, we go to our laptop, or if we're like old school, we may go get a notepad. But, at certain points, these certainly electronics, but even paper and pencils and all of these things were, contraband for Black folks. And so we don't have those records. And sometimes when we do, those records are intentionally destroyed. And so we really prioritize oral tradition, right? Because it's important to understand that that's really a part of our, a part of the way that we have collected these stories. And so when we're doing this work, we collaborate with historians and professors, but we're also collaborating with tour guides, right? Think about Wilmington has a really great tour bus that Wilmington in Color, that takes anybody who, comes to Wilmington, they can get on that bus and you can get a tour of areas that are relevant to the massacre. And same thing in Tulsa. They're like all of these people who are kind of doing this work, who know these stories. It's the elders in the communities. It's, the man, there's a man in Greenwood who sits out in front of his shop still today. And, he can tell you anything you want to know about the massacre, things that I couldn't find until I dug deep in the archives at the university. And so these are the people that we want to engage. And I also think that as it relates to anything related to these massacres, we really have to center these descendants, the people who are descendants of these massacres, the people who are victims of these massacres, because some of those individuals are still alive. And so that's how we integrate the arts. While we value the archives and while we value the historical accounts and the wonderful books that people are writing, we know that much of the story is told in other spaces. And so we find those stories.
I love that. Right. And so we're at the end of this conversation, and I want to make a few minutes for some Q&A, but I do have like questions from the audience from people who have been sending them in. I do have one question for you all, right? So as we reflect on this month, and how can we use the lessons from our past to inspire actions today? Like more specifically, what steps do you feel like we can take, advocate for, that attendees, people who are listening and tuning in, can take to advocate for systemic change in their own communities?
I'll go first. I take the lessons from the St. Louis Bank. I mean, there were people who had one stock certificate that they got on credit, that they would pay to put on layaway, but they were investing coins, not paper money, in their accounts, but they didn't hesitate to feel empowered, that their voices mattered. And so I say, do what they did. I mean, start at your kitchen table with your family, your girlfriends, your friends, that you have over, your co-workers, your church family, and just start to get together and begin to educate yourselves to talk about money, talk about these issues, that we are talking about. People have book clubs. There are some great books. I mean, you can use our books. You can maybe talk to us a little bit to try to see if they could fit in a book club. But I just, put one in there, Jessica Norwood's book, Believe in You, Money. So, I mean, just, you don't have to have a lot to kind of echo what Dr. Winford was saying, what Brandon was saying. You just have to start. You already have the curiosity. You're already, you're here. We've given you some knowledge, things that many of you knew, reinforcing things so many of you others knew. And so now you can take this and then you share it with others and you talk together and figure out ways to, to move forward. I think that's a really important step, is just taking the step.
Brandon, how about you?
So many thoughts. Well, I guess one thing is that, what are you most pissed off about in this particular moment? Whether it's a economic issue, it's a health issue, the list goes on. I find an organization like the Black Massacre Project. Find an organization that aligns itself with addressing in a real way the issues that you're most concerned about, and get involved on that basis, right? One of the things that in this conversation about Black business, we look at people who are philanthropists as these really, really wealthy people. And there's a book called Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Wealth by Tyrone McKinley Freeman, where he talks about the ways in which we should rethink our understanding of what it means to be a Black philanthropist in particular. All right, we give in so many different ways and to so many different causes, both financially, which is important, but also in other ways in terms of service, right? In the ways in which we can think about our service as a kind of philanthropy and a kind of our responsibility to the community. When we think about sort of Black business, they're interested in making money, but there is always this built-in sort of commitment, this sort of, I like to refer to it as sort of this dualism, which is really this responsibility to community, using that money to serve the community, whether we're talking about support for organizations and so forth and so on. And so what is that responsibility to community that you feel, that you think is important, and where in your local community can you sort of, begin to sort of still be pissed, but work toward a solution to make sure that you're moving away from just being pissed. So I'll stop there.
I appreciate it. And so with that, I really want to open this up. There's a couple of questions that came into the chat that I would like to see if we can take a few minutes to answer. Right. The first one was, and anybody can answer this, right? So like, were there a lot of white communities or communities close to the 50-50 African-American white communities that were bulldozed by highway programs?
Yeah, I'll jump on this one. So just to use the example of Durham, North Carolina, and I write about urban renewal in Durham in one of the chapters of my book. So the answer is that many of these urban renewal programs, in the conversations, they did studies that identified particular areas in particular cities to highlight as in need of like revitalization, in need of urban renewal. And what do you know? Most of those areas were Black neighborhoods. Now, when we think about sort of these highways, like in Durham, the Durham Freeway, Highway 147, that went through the heart of the Black community, they also impacted working class white neighborhoods as well, right? So while these urban renewal programs specifically unfold in Black communities where there's the major Black neighborhoods, they do impact other communities. And just as a side note, in thinking about these urban renewal projects in urban renewal, there's another component to this. All right, and in North Carolina, it's the Research Triangle Park. At the same time that you have urban renewal, you have the beginnings of Research Triangle Park, where this highway was built, and it provided a thoroughfare that connected the major research universities, Duke University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina State Universities in South Durham. And so there's a displacement of African Americans, no conversations about incorporating the local Black school, North Carolina Central University. So there's a displacement of Black people while you're moving in these new people, right, to come work for these universities and to come work in the Research Triangle Park. And so there's this economic windfall or economic aspect of it is always sort of in place that is a priority over whatever conversations about redevelopment in these Black communities, right? Which is really not part of the conversation. And then I think as we assess these individual urban renewal programs, we have to do it from an individual basis, and they have a lot of similarities and commonalities. But in Durham, African-American leaders, people like John Henry Wheeler, he was involved in the Durham Redevelopment Commission, the organization agency tasked with overseeing urban renewal. The Durham Committee, they had looked at these proposals, and in many ways, his support of urban renewal and the Black support of the bond referendum that went towards the city's part in terms of what they were supposed to pay was supported by the Black community in their votes, because many of these leaders, and you can call them what you want, they believed in some ways that afterwards African-American businesses, homeowners will be able to tap back into a larger marketplace. Now, this is on the basis of, in all of their dealings with city leaders on particular issues, whether it's on education, they had served the best interest of these Black communities. And so the critique is that they sold people down the river, that they benefited in part. But I also think there's another sort of layer there that we have to really sort of look at to understand other kinds of support. That's not to say that their people were not sort of thinking about their own economic self-interest, right? Because many of these business people did have property that they sold to the city and made money off of that. So I want to sort of make sure that was clear when we think about sort of urban renewal and sort of what was also happening in sort of working class white neighborhoods who were impacted by these by the highways that ran through the heart of these communities.
Thank you for that. And Kenya, I want to ask this question to you, right? Like we were talking about this a little earlier. Like, how can we use the lessons from the past to inspire today? Like, what do you see as like steps that those who are listening in can take to advocate for systemic change in their own communities?
Thank you. So, I mean, I think the first thing here is, you can't use the lessons from the past if you don't know the lessons from the past. And so it's critically important that we start to spend more time studying, trends and even like the narrative history of the people, Black people in this country. We have to do it, and we can't necessarily rely on what we thought happened, right? So one of the things that was trending for a few years, trending a few years ago was this expression, I'm not my ancestors. And I'm like, you should be your ancestors, right? Because I think that we don't necessarily have a true understanding of the level of organization, commitment, and strategy that our ancestors and forefathers used to be afforded the rights that we currently have now, right? And so I think that your first step is starting to absorb information about various histories of Black people in this country. And we know that we aren't a monolith, and we know that geography plays a part, nationality plays a part, but just really kind of studying that. And the reason you want to study it is, again, these oppressors are not innovators, right? They aren't really doing anything very different, even if they use new technology. Artificial intelligence is used a lot for many helpful, in many helpful ways, but also in ways that are harmful to communities, and in particular are harmful to Black communities. There are scholars that talk about the disparity, the racial disparity that exists. And, we want to say it's a robot, but, it's the robot who cannot pick up your face, or it's a robot that requires me to put the light part of my hand underneath the sink 5 times in order for the water to run, right? So there are these biases and disparities that exist, but they aren't new, right? They're based on the premises of anti-Black premises that have existed in this country, and really anti-Black premises and sentiment that have existed in the world for centuries. And so you can't really combat that in the most effective ways if you don't know those stories. And so I would encourage everyone to, do more research on, on the history of the people in this country, and not just the bad stuff, right? Sometimes people ask me about doing research on Black massacres, and is it super heavy? And sometimes it can be, but what we focus on when we look at these incredible communities is the vibrance, it's the self-sufficiency, it's the way that they were able to create literally everything out of nothing, right? And so when we're thinking about these communities, it's not just about slavery, it's not just about Jim Crow or the Black codes or other periods of time when we were subjugated. It's really about looking at the ways that we were able to persist and be excellent in the face of lots of oppression coming from every side. So if you want to start that journey, the first thing I would say is start to learn about the history in a meaningful way.
Thank you for that. Got 2 final questions that we're going to ask, right? And so the first question, we couldn't get to them all, right? So there was a question that was asked about FDR, right? What are your thoughts on FDR and his policies on banking regulations and how that affected African American communities?
I'll jump in and take that one right quick. I think the Black experience, especially with the New Deal, was very similar to their experience, after the Civil War, after, the Civil Rights Movement. There was this sense of kind of an opening up of opportunity, and then the door in many ways was shut. But even from Hoover, before FDR, and from Hoover to FDR, African American banks and insurance companies, financial institutions in particular, were really anxious to to take advantage of the federal programs, in part because, there had been a long tradition of, African Americans being a feeling that they would be able to make more progress, in terms of securing rights through the federal government than through their, especially in the South, through their and North, through their local, state and local governments. And so African Americans, were applying to be part of the different federal agencies under Hoover, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, which then continued under FDR, and then with the FDIC and other kinds of programs that FDR instituted. But for the St. Luke Bank in particular, some of the kind of bank bailout programs that were under FDR's administration would have required the bank to give up a lot of its autonomy. So, for example, they had a program where the bank would kind of the government would invest money in the bank to just try to help them pay bills, meet, payroll, and start, getting money, pumping money back out into the community. But they had to, give up a certain amount of stock. The board had to answer to these federal, bureaucrats. And so banks like St. Luke, made the decision not to participate in some programs because it was pretty clear that the kinds of decisions that these outsiders would have made would have adversely affected, their customer base. And then the other thing too is these banks and insurance companies in particular really want to take advantage of programs like the FHA, but the kind of racist undertones continue to marginalize them within these kind of federal programs. So one of the kind of experiences with the New Deal and during the Great Depression is that it was this kind of opportunity that a door possibility opening, but then just quickly being shut again on African American financial innovation.
Thank you. And the final question that we have, right?
If I could add one to that. Everything Shennette just said. And one of the other things is that with sort of access in many ways to the federal government's kind of investments and things like Reconstruction Finance Corporation, FDIC, Federal Housing Administration, African-American businesses, especially these large insurance companies and banks, also use this as a way to demonstrate to these federal agencies, but also to these other their white counterparts, that the Black borrower was going to pay back their loans, right? And so part of, in this particular conversation, part of the ways in which they also sought to demonstrate the capacity for African Americans to satisfy their loan. And actually, in terms of the data, they were better at paying off and paying back their loans than their white counterparts at a more consistent rate. So I just want to sort of throw that in as well.
No, that was right on time. That was right on time. My final question that came into the chat was from Tim, and Tim was saying that, can we speak to redlining and how that figures into all of this that we're talking about? If anybody wants to take that on.
I don't necessarily want to take on the whole question, but I just want to say that redlining is a legacy of slavery. It's one of the legacies of slavery, and we can see the ways this kind of pernicious effect because they have sites. I'll try to put it in here before we leave, where they'll show you that these previously redlined communities are places where you have the food deserts, where you have the lack of access to financial institutions. They don't have trees, their environmental, racism, and destruction there. So my point is just to say that redlining is a legacy of slavery, and that we are still really kind of dealing with the consequences, not just of redlining, but of these legacies.
Can't get no more specific than that. Like that's just the whole of it all, right? And so thank you everybody tuning in and being a part of this deep discussion with us. I hope that you enjoyed it and all the insights from the panelists. What we're going to do is make sure that we follow up with you, because there's a ton of resources that we've been sharing it throughout the chat. We're going to make sure that you'll be able to have access to this. If you'd like to share this information, and we thank you for being here. And so the one thing that I'll leave you all with is just say that as you see what we've talked about, it's an opportunity for you guys to present the institutions that you bank at and tell them about the ideas that you have when it comes to investing in the public health and safety of the communities. You're like reaching out to them saying that this is what we'd like to see in our communities. And just remember that you actually have a power to be able to create change. And so thank you. If you enjoyed this, share this and tell everybody about it. This will not be the last time that we convene. And so with that, have a good night.